We're recording. Ready when you are.
Okay. Hi, my name is Bassmaster Ralph McNeil, a member of Martin Luther King Jr. Lodge number 29 under the Princehall Grand Lodge of Arizona. This is the second part of my lecture on Princehall Freemasonry. In part one of my lecture, I left off talking about the union of 5 supreme councils that merged into 2. One of the reasons this took place was to eradicate those who were still members of the National Grand Lodge 33rd degree status. During the 1870s, there were many Grand Lodges leaving or merging with their National Grand Lodge counterpart to establish a sovereign Grand Lodge. This was a successful merger in many jurisdictions for Princehall Masons, finally becoming a sovereign Grand Lodge. A Grand Lodge would only answer to herself and to herself only. However, one must realize the mindset of those who emancipated and could become a Freemason regardless of their potential affiliation. To start off part 2, we should realize what exactly took place during the 1860s. The Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. The movie Glory showed a captive audience of how men of color would die for their country and earn their rights. However, many were not aware of the regiments that consisted of Princehall Masons. I would be remiss in my presentation if I did not mention members who were recruiters for the 54th and the 55th regiments. Past Grand Master Lewis Hayden of the Princehall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, and Brother Martin R. Delaney was a member of the Princehall Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. William Matthews was also a recruiter for the 1st Kansas Colored Regiment. After the Civil War, another group of African Americans were mustered into what we know today as the 9th and 10th Cavalries and the 24th and 25th Regiments. They were called the Buffalo Soldiers. These soldiers would prove to America that the African American can fight for his country. All this information can be found in a book written by the late brother Joseph A. Walks Jr., Black Square and Compass, 200 Years of Princehall Freemasonry. As a result of the Civil War, men of color served as members of Congress. Some were members of Princehall Freemasonry. The 41st and 42nd Congress consisted of 7 African American congressmen. The Reconstruction era also had past Grand Master Oscar J. Dunn, who served as Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana in 1868. He was a member of the Princehall Grand Lodge, Louisiana. When Reconstruction was ushered out of the South, they were the largest Grand Lodges in the Deep South. Princehall Freemasonry had 2 divided camps, one for nationalism and the other for sovereignty of Grand Lodges. The 1880s were great times for Princehall Masonry. The fight for recognition always prevailed. Samuel Clark's The Negro Mason and Equity was a paper presented by the Princehall Grand Lodge of Ohio. The information contained within this paper eventually became a strong pamphlet. Within this pamphlet, we find the word Princehall Mason. Within this pamphlet, we also find that Princehall was named a provincial Grand Master. Many who claim to be Princehall scholars stated that Grimshaw was the first who wrote and fabricated this, but it was Clark who mentioned this in his presentation. Looking at the appointments for provincial Grand Masters back in the 1780s and 1790s, there was no mention of Princehall. Many mergers took place between Princehall Grand Lodges and former Grand Lodges beholden to the National Grand Lodge. However, in 1888, the National Grand Master, William Matthews, issued his great manifesto. This manifesto was sent to all Princehall Grand Lodges, ordering those sovereign Grand Lodges to come back to the National Grand Lodge or else face the consequences. Princehall Grand Lodges did not bother to respond, so National Grand Master Matthews started setting up lodges and Grand Lodges in jurisdictions where there was an established Princehall Grand Lodge. Also, there was a call of Grand Lodges to meet in Chicago in August 1887. This was a precursor for what is now the Princehall Conference of Grand Masters. M.A. Clark served as its first chairman. The conference met sporadically for a few years, and in 1920, the conference agreed to call themselves the Princehall Conference of Grand Masters. The 1890s also proved to be a great and turbulent time for Princehall Freemasonry. In 1893, John G. Jones founded the Shrine for Princehall Affiliated Masonry, but Jones also lost the election for the position of Most Puissant Sovereign Grand Commander for the United Supreme Council Southern Jurisdiction. As a result of losing that election, Jones decided to start up his own Supreme Council, his own shrine organization, and also established lodges and grand lodges. As a result of Jones' annex, the Princehall Shrine was reorganized and called themselves the Ancient Egyptian Arabic Order Nobles of the Mystic Shrine. Past Grand Master William Upton's paper, presented on the floor of his Grand Lodge, talked about men of color with Masonic degrees. The Grand Lodge of Washington State was the first Grand Lodge to recognize Princehall Masonry, and she paid a price for that recognition, only to have other Grand Lodges serve recognition with her. But it was Upton who basically had this presentation printed by the Princehall Grand Lodge in Massachusetts in 1902. In 1903, past Grand Master William H. Grimshaw wrote his book on Princehall Masonry, titled The Official History of Freemasonry Among Colored People of America. His book was challenged by the Princehall Grand Lodge in Massachusetts in 1905 and 1906. However, his history was accepted as fact from the 1900s to the present. If you look at all of the Princehall affiliated Grand Lodge web pages, you will see not all the Grand Lodges are on the same page when it comes to Princehall affiliated history. However, Grimshaw's historical version of Princehall and Princehall Freemasonry prevailed. His result of Princehall, born in 1748, has long been accepted as the gospel in Princehall. In part one of my lecture, I mentioned how Princehall was not born in 1748, that he was not a man of the cloth, and that he was not a Grand Master. Grand Lodges had not gone unscathed by Grimshaw's research. There was a claim that Social Lodge No. 1 under the Princehall Grand Lodge of D.C. was the first lodge under the Mason-Dixon line. Grimshaw did not include Friendship Lodge from Maryland as the first, nor did he show where Friendship was chartered as No. 6 and Social Lodge chartered as No. 7 under the first independent African Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. Grimshaw also put forth misinformation about Warrior Grand Lodge. The sad part is this: all authors, mainstream and Princehall affiliated, use Grimshaw as a source. From George Crawford to one of our modern days writers, Alton Roundtree, all have used Grimshaw some way or another as a source. The Masonic researcher, excuse me.
It's okay. Start off with from Masonic researchers.
Where now?
You said from Masonic researchers?
Oh, excuse me.
All right, you
The
pick that
Masonic
up.
researcher Harold Van Buren Voorhees used Grimshaw's as a source in his book, Negro Masonry in the United States. The book was published in the 1940s. Voorhees had no choice but to take his book off the book stands due to so many errors. Getting back to the beginning of the 20th century, Princehall Masonry had issues with many who started up Grand Lodges back in the early 1900s. This spread like a cancer. Those who were expelled from Princehall affiliated Masonry started Grand Lodges on their own. Men such as John G. Jones and John A. Bell were raking in unsuspected profanes for a minimal price. For many years, Princehall affiliated Masonry tried to combat bogus and irregular Masonry in the court system. Princehall won some cases and lost some. However, the law of the land made decisions to not let some of these organizations call themselves Freemasons. But these groups were sprouted up as other organizations. Case in point were some Grand Lodges in this day and era. All of a sudden, many Grand Lodges were not on the radar anymore, only to pop up as a Grand Lodge under the regular Grand Lodge of England, a spurious group out of England. During the years of 1910 and 1920, Princehall affiliated Masonry continued to grow. But in 1914, there was a lawsuit against the Princehall Shrine submitted in Georgia. To add more injury, there was another lawsuit in Texas in 1918. There were some serious fundraising drives to help out the legal team for the Princehall Shriners. Finally, in 1929, the Supreme Court rendered a decision on behalf of the Princehall Shriners. This day, it is now known as Jubilee Day amongst Princehall affiliated Shriners, and is celebrated every June. World War I was being fought, and Princehall affiliated Masonry had military lodges attached to those units. After the war, men of color were thinking that fighting for the country, things would change back in America. Not so. There were massacres that went on in a few states. In 1921, the black section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street, was burned to the ground. In 1923, the all-black city of Rosewood, Florida, was burnt down. Lodges burned down and also lodge members murdered. The information about lodge members being murdered can be found in a report given by the University of Florida. In 1924, a significant event happened. The white Northern Supreme Council contacted the Princehall affiliated Northern Supreme Council asking them to change their name. Though Princehall affiliated Supreme Council did change their name, this was the first interaction between the groups. The Great Depression took a toll among some membership. However, Princehall affiliated Masonry prevailed. The 30s were rocky. A few Grand Lodges lost buildings. During the 1940s, a series of meetings took place between the Main Street Supreme Council and the Princehall affiliated Supreme Council. As a result of these meetings, the Scottish Rite rituals, Northern jurisdiction, Princehall affiliated, were rewritten by the Main Street Supreme Council. And also the book, A History of Freemasonry Among Negroes in America, was paid for by the Main Street Supreme Council. Because of these meetings, the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts chose to recognize the Princehall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. However, the backlash would change the mind of those who dared to recognize African American Masonry. After World War II, the member of Freemasonry would double. Princehall Freemasonry would go through some turbulent times. Victim Shriners would bring Princehall affiliated Masonry to a standstill. Grand Masters meddling into the Shrine's appointments would bring chaos among Princehall affiliated Masonry. The healing would take place at the first pilgrimage in 1954 in Massachusetts. This is where all Princehall affiliated bodies return to pay homage to Princehall. This still happens in this day and age. Princehall Freemasonry, back during the 1940s and 50s, had research lodges up and running, but only to have Grand Masters have these lodges closed due to some sort of power struggle. There are two operating today, one under the Princehall Grand Lodge in New Jersey, and the other under the Princehall Grand Lodge in District of Columbia. During the 1950s, the case Brown versus the Board of Education was center stage. This case was being fought for the equality of a good education for African American kids. The lead attorney on this case was a Princehall Mason by the name of Thurgood Marshall. Princehall Grand Lodges rallied behind Brother Marshall by contributing toward the NAACP Defense Fund. During the 1960s, Princehall affiliated Masonry took a few bogus lodges to court and won once again. Many mainstream leaders testified on her behalf. In the 1970s, the first United Supreme Council was held in the country of Liberia. Princehall Masonry had her roots in Liberia since in the early 1800s. Members of the Princehall Grand Lodge of Connecticut were traveling missionaries and opened lodges in Liberia. Because of unrest in Liberia, Freemasonry was dark until recently. The ironic thing is that the Grand Lodge of Liberia was recognized before any Princehall Grand Lodge was recognized stateside. In the late 1980s, past Grand Master Daniel Lumford from the Princehall Grand Lodge of Washington sought recognition with the United Grand Lodge of England. But Lumford ended up rescinding that letter so that the Princehall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts would have that honor. During that time, the Princehall Grand Lodge of Connecticut was shaking and moving. She was by far more aggressive on the issue of recognition than her sister Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. The Grand Lodge of Connecticut and the Princehall Grand Lodge of Connecticut had passed into law that anyone wearing a square compass who was not a member of both Grand Lodges was subjected to a $500 fine. In 1994, an event happened that would change Freemasonry. The United Grand Lodge of England recognized the Princehall Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. But behind the door negotiations was a lot to be desired. The United Grand Lodge of England asked for the charter that Massachusetts had kept under her watch for 207 years. Past Grand Master Nicholas Locker was Grand Master at that time and told the United Grand Lodge of England emphatically no. However, the provision was that each Grand Lodge who sought recognition had to be recognized by their mainstream counterpart. The late brothers Joseph A. Walks Jr. and Brother Nelson King consulted many leaders during this period of time. While the leaders on both sides were walking with their chest out, they should not forget the two brothers mentioned. These two brothers took death threats and hate mails from what we call Freemasons. Recognition was rolling between Grand Lodges in the United States. As of today, there is some sort of fraternal recognition. 42 Grand Lodges now enjoy some sort of recognition, while the remaining 9 do not. These Grand Lodges are below the Mason-Dixon line. These Grand Lodges are, number 1, the Grand Lodge of Alabama, number 2, the Grand Lodge of Georgia, number 3, the Grand Lodge of Mississippi, Number 4, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. Number 5, the Grand Lodge of Florida. Number 6, the Grand Lodge of South Carolina. Number 7, the Grand Lodge of Arkansas. Number 8, the Grand Lodge of West Virginia. And number 9, the Grand Lodge of Tennessee. While some of these Grand Lodges recognize Grand Lodges in Africa, these same Grand Lodges come up with all kinds of excuses when it comes to recognizing Princehall affiliated Masonry. If one would look at the recognition map and the map of the Confederacy, there's not much of a difference. The issue still prevails in 9 jurisdictions that contain more than 50% of all the Princehall affiliated Masons in the United States of America. What I have read and what I have seen is that these 9 Grand Lodges still have an issue with descendants of African American slaves practicing Freemasonry. This concludes my lecture, and I hope that many will gain some sort of understanding about Freemasonry for men of color. I know a lot of information was presented. It's my hope that you, the audience, gain something out of this presentation. I'd like to thank Brother Jack Buda, who is filming and behind the camera on this piece, Worshipful Master Todd Trutner, for the use of Paradise Valley Civil Trial Lodge number 29, the Princehall Grand Lodge of Arizona, Brother Jeff Ballou, and Brother Al McClellan. Thanks, and have a great time.